Good morning, everyone. Very warm welcome to you all at today's Thoughtful Thursday session, Alcohol and Dementia, Fact or Fiction. My name is Aisling McDowell from Irish in Britain. I'll be hosting today's session. Before I hand over to my colleague and our speakers for today, just going to run through some housekeeping. So this session, as with all our Thoughtful Thursdays, is being recorded. It will be uploaded onto our website as a learning resource. Everybody who's attending are on mute and your mic and your cameras are off. If you would like to contribute, which we encourage throughout the session, you can do so using the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen or the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll leave some space at the end of the session, towards the end, for a Q&A section. So please do post any contributions or questions or queries in either the chat box or the Q&A box, and I'll be monitoring that throughout. I'll also be posting some links, some interesting links there in the chat box, so keep an eye on that. I think that's probably all for housekeeping from me. So I will hand over to Zibby, who is our Cuimhne coordinator. She'll say a few words and then she'll introduce our speaker for today. So over to you, Zibby.
Thank you, Aisling, and a warm welcome to you all, especially if this may be your first Thoughtful Thursday that you're joining with Irish in Britain. We've been running a programme, a Cuimhne programme, a memory programme for a number of years now, and we're delighted as part of our series of Cuimhne Thoughtful Thursdays to welcome today a special guest, Dr Tony Rao, who you will know is an expert in alcohol misuse. He is a consultant old age psychiatrist at the Institute of Psychiatry and with the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust, and he's also a writer and an educator. He's been developing training for people around alcohol misuse, and he has a special interest in older people. He's here to talk today with us on the topic of dementia and alcohol, facts or fiction, and we are very much looking forward to hearing from you, Tony, and to having the chance to ask some questions at the end. I'm also very pleased to welcome Dr Mary Tilkey, our Cuimhne patron. I'm going to hand over to Mary to say a few words before we begin.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Thoughtful Thursday. I'm really delighted to have Dr. Tony Rao speaking with us today. I've been following Tony's work for many years now, and particularly like the way in which he deals with the people who have the problem rather than just the alcohol. Our aim today is to raise awareness and to provide information about this important topic. There's a lot of sensitivity around alcohol in the Irish community, and we're often stereotyped as people with an alcohol problem or drunks, and you would be very familiar with those stereotypes. The aim of the session today is not to moralize or to judge people, and is certainly not to point the finger at the Irish community, because the issue of alcohol and old age is much wider than our community. As Dr. Rao will testify, alcohol use and misuse by older people is a growing issue, and it is implicated in a number of health concerns, not just dementia. It's probably become much worse during the pandemic because of isolation, because of loneliness, bereavement, anxiety, and the social and relationship stresses that all communities have had. And I know from our member organisations that the older Irish population in England have been hit very badly. Now, we recognise that many Irish people are lifetime abstainers, and there are other people who are very moderate drinkers, but it's also important to acknowledge that we do have an alcohol-related problem in our community. We have somewhere in the region of 10,000 people with dementia in England, and although only a few of those will be alcohol-related dementias, alcohol is likely to be implicated more than we imagine. The image of the down and out, or the person who can't get going in the morning without alcohol, kind of hides the grey area where a lot of people are probably drinking more than is good for their health. Even if our pattern of consumption hasn't changed very much, as we get older, our bodies are less able to metabolize the alcohol. So it has a more damaging effect than it would have on a younger person. Alcohol accounts for a large proportion of visits to A&E. It's also implicated in a complex manner in depression, anxiety, and suicide. And alcohol has shown to be linked to a number of cancers that we experience disproportionately in our Irish community. So I think it's important to think about dementia, but it is also important that we think about alcohol in the wider context of Irish health. And Dr. Rao, Tony Rao's clinical researcher, well known in the field of old age psychiatry. But what I like about Tony's work is his focus on the people and the society rather than the problem. He's worked for many years in South London, in the most deprived areas of South London. And he has brought this experience to life in 2 books, which he's published in the last couple of years, which we will put on, the details of which we'll put on the website. They're called Catch Me When I Fall and Soul Trader. So I'm absolutely delighted to invite Tony to talk to us today. Thank you.
Okay, can you, let's just get this onto full. Can you all see that?
Yes, that's great, thank you.
Good, you can hear me as well. I can move my sidebars. God, it's difficult to know where to start with this one. I know that there are people who are going to be watching this after the recording has finished, maybe over the next few days or weeks, but I just wanted to say that I have a very special attachment to the Irish community. I knew nothing about the Irish community. I was brought up in East Anglia, and there wasn't really a very large Irish population there. And suddenly I found myself transported into an area of Southeast London, which I think was in the top 3 in the population, the diaspora of Irish people who had left Ireland in not just in the 1950s, but also after the Great Famine in the 1850s. And so I think Bermondsey probably historically holds the largest, I suppose, legacy of Irish culture, one of the largest communities with a legacy from our Irish culture in the whole of the UK. And I just learned so much about everything from the culture and lifestyle, from the sort of food, from the dance and Patrick's Day, right through to things like the pledge. I'll talk about that in a minute. So I suppose the other thing I wanted to do in introducing this talk was that as Mary said, I came from a very academic background before I actually began my consultant post. And I just felt that any opportunity that I've had in the last 22 years, since I'm in a consultant, to draw me away from my clinical work, I've always stuck with the Bermondsey population. And it was actually, ironically, an older Irish gentleman who had repeated admissions to the ward, to my ward in 2003. He was an unmarried older Irish gentleman who'd worked on the roads, had almost struck himself to death, and he developed dementia. And I thought, this is really not on. So I did an MSc in addictions, and I knew nothing about addiction. I spent £4,000 of my own money on an MSc in addictions, really to improve the lot of not just the Irish community, but the general community in terms of my patients within Bermondsey. And hopefully the rest is history. We've got the books, but also I've done research, policy change. And every minute's been a pleasure seeing people in their own homes. I think I calculated I've done between 3,000 and 4,000 home visits over the course of the last 22 years, and trying to give what I can to help all the communities within Bermondsey. So when I was preparing this talk, I had a choice. Could I just bore you with facts and figures, or could I tell you a little bit about my cultural immersion into the Irish community? And so I spent quite a lot of time developing the latter, which I hope will be helpful to you in terms of my perspective on my experiences within the Irish community. My first stop, and I got to know this organisation very quickly within the first few within the first few months actually of my time in Bermondsey, was the Southwark Irish Pensioners Project. And I mentioned to everyone earlier that I would meet the outreach workers at the bus stop, and they're just things that just stick in my mind, which I've never told anyone before. One of them was, I was talking to one of the workers at the bus stop must be about 20 years ago, about interventions, the kind of thing that we would do from a mental health point of view to reduce harm. And he said getting people food and a roof over their head is probably one of the most important things. And that I suppose that ingrained into me the fact that, particularly with older people with mental health problems, not just the alcohol, it's changing their social circumstances, which is probably the most important thing that's going to change their health, not vice versa. So that is where I started from 20 years ago, and that's where I have. That's the road along which I've continued to travel. So let me just try and, because I've got all these screens up here. Hold on, I'm just going to try and minimize my view so I can see what I'm looking at. So what happened in 2003 was I undertook an MSc in addictions, so knew absolutely nothing about addictions. And because of my kind of passion, which is where it all started, to improve the health of the older Irish population in Bermondsey, I undertook a research project, and I don't think it's since been matched actually within old age psychiatry services. And this is, you're talking about 20 years ago. And it was comparing older Irish people who drank, who drank any alcohol at all, compared with English drinkers. And I just kind of, that sounds like a soundbite there, but it is very much the stigma, the shame, and the external stereotyping. And that stereotyping, unfortunately, means that people self-label them, they label themselves, and therefore don't seek these services that they both need and deserve. And it's interesting to note, it's not on any of these slides, when I did my research project, the rate of refuse, even the research project was actually titled Health and Lifestyle in Older People. The interesting thing was that people were very skeptical about what I was up to, I think, because I think I mentioned alcohol use, probably I had to in the blurb, in the introduction. And the interesting thing I found was that a third of the Irish population whom I've approached refused to be interviewed, compared with something like 15% of the English population. It shows how Irish ethnicity is very much tainted, again, by this stigma, shame, and stereotyping that's gone on over, I was going to say, I mean, it's literally over 200 years. Not just it's sort of from the 1850s onwards, not just the 1950s. And of course, there's the other group of the other population, some of whom returned with the Celtic Tiger boom, who came in the 1980s. But predominantly, we were talking about the older Irish population who had emigrated from Ireland in the 1950s, and as Mary has mentioned in the video on the Cuimhne older Irish memory loss, well, the Irish Memory Loss Project. It was very much a population that has been predominantly affected by deprivation and social isolation. So I want to begin this by talking about my external, not just research, but my cultural immersion into the Irish community in Bermondsey. And the first thing I wanted to say, and you all know this, that what happens with statistics is that you look at BAME populations, and the Irish population is lumped together with the sort of white population, is all lumped together. It completely misses the Irish population who came here and faced huge stigmatization and marginalization and I suppose both racial abuse and racial stereotyping that led to some of the problems that have happened over the last 70, 80 years, if not longer. And so what I discovered was that a lot of the experience of the impact of or the relationship between drinking and the Irish culture of people who emigrated here at that time was largely anecdotal. So in 2003, what I did was I did a research project so I looked at how alcohol use of older Irish people in Bermondsey could be distinguished. What factors were important to distinguish them from English drinkers? And one of the things I didn't mention to Mary earlier is I'm actually going to give you the original paper that was rejected. Can you believe this? I submitted a paper to about 5 alcohol journals, and because it was qualitative, and in other words, it wasn't actually, it was experiences, and because it was the older Irish population, I just think people just couldn't be bothered, and I think it's another example of personally of racism. Okay, so what? People have different cultural experiences. So I'm actually, it's never been released before. I'm actually going to donate, if you like, that paper that was never ever published to the Irish in Britain project, because I think it's something that you would perhaps want to read. And I'm going to give you the bullet points of that in this. So what the interviews did was they covered the experience of drinking over the lifespan in the older Irish population in Bermondsey, looking at things like personal circumstances around drinking behaviour, the effect of taking the pledge. I mean, I had never heard of this, the pledge, the priest sort of knocking on your door at any time of the day or night saying, have you taken the pledge? I know it's something that perhaps doesn't happen so much now, but there was very much, I found a very bimodal distribution, people who were abstainers and people who drank very heavily. And those who drank very heavily didn't always seek help, again, through stigma, shame and stereotyping. And there were immense differences between the two communities. So when I looked at what I would call harmful use, the intake of alcohol, the consumption of alcohol, that had meant that the older Irish population had problems with their health or their from a legal point of view, or social problems, I found it very often boiled down to these sort of things like public order offences, things like physical illness, whether it's cancer, whether it's liver disease, things like hospital admissions, things like, obviously there were quite a few alcohol-related deaths, sadly, in the older Irish population, because they didn't seek help early enough. And again, that my first book, although the protagonist wasn't an Irish person, my book, it very much taps into that in terms of help-seeking behaviour and not detecting problems until they're too late. Mental health problems. It is very sad to know that when I was in the community team, I've now moved on, but I would say 80 to 90% of my patients were Irish, and the reason why I had to see them is because they wouldn't seek help anywhere else, and we were the last bastion of help for them. A lot of older men that I saw had separated or divorced from their wives because of their drinking, and some of them had even lost their job. Just so sad to see. And so what I did was I actually looked at what were the protective factors. I hope this is of interest to all of you. The protective factors, although this isn't specifically related to dementia, thought because it's the only project that I can think of that's been done in this population, one of the only ones in terms of mental health. There were very much protective factors, such as being in contact with children, still being married, still adhering to their sort of religion, if you like, and their faith. And there were vulnerability factors such as low income, early loss of job, no peer group, and being away from home. One of the things that probably did stand out for me in the whole of my interview, and they were very long. They were hour-long interviews for each of the people that I saw, was the fact that the older Irish men used to tell me that they used to drink with other older Irish men. One, because they shared the same culture and things that they could talk about, but two, because they couldn't mix with the English population. And similarly, when I talked to the older English people, they would just talk about the Irish. And it was just so sad to see this cultural marginalization that was still happening right from 1950 until the present day. That was 20 years ago. So sort of 50 years, 60 years later. And I know this is probably not going to trigger some of you, but because some of the chapters in my book, and I hope you will take the opportunity to read it. Funnily enough, the project is actually going to Time and Talents, which is another voluntary organisation in Bermondsey. But this was, I can't match Frank Hart and Donald Lunny in their song, but I just wanted to read this to you because it will mean a lot to all of you here in terms of the experiences that the older Irish population went through when they left Ireland. So, oh, farewell to poor Erin's Isle, I now must leave you for a while. The rent and taxes are so high, I can no longer stay. From Dublin Quay I sailed away and landed here, but yesterday My shoes and brogues and my shirt are all that's in my kit. I have just called in to let you know the sights I've seen before I go, of the ups and downs of Ireland since the year of 48. And if our nation had its own, our noble sons would stay at home, but since fortune had proved otherwise, poor Pat must emigrate. It brings a tear to my eye, but I'm sure it will to you, to yours. So it does mean a lot to me seeing this, the culture and the way that the Dickensian lives that people led, even in the early 2000s when I went to see people, and for some things have not improved that much, and marginalisation still exists. So let me come on to kind of something more factual for you. I hope that kind of struck a chord with you and sort of demonstrated to you. I mean, the title of my talk probably should have been called Alcohol Agus Nialtra. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So this is to give you a sort of cultural overview of the way that alcohol has influenced the culture of the whole of Western society, right from the UK, America, Australia, all the developed countries, and that is the baby boomers. So for those of you who grew up here, like I did, when I grew up in the 1960s, you'll know that when we were growing up, and I'm pretty sure that it would have been the same in Ireland as well. When we were growing up, our life was heavily influenced by alcohol advertising, whether it was Leonard Rossiter and Joan Collins on television, whether it was this attitude that, I mean, I gave a talk yesterday and I said the same thing, this attitude that if you didn't get drunk, you were a party pooper. If you didn't say, I forgot what I did the night before because I was drunk, you were considered uncool. Now, luckily, this population of millennials and those who are younger have more interest in their health. A lot of it's to do with the fact they can't spend the money and go out, but besides that, they don't drink as much. And so this population of baby boomers throughout the world in developed countries who were born between 1946 and 1964, the oldest of this population turned 40 in 1986 and 65 in 2011. And I always say to my older psychiatry colleagues, if you think that there's a tsunami of alcohol problems in older people, you ain't seen nothing yet, because I'm 57. So the group of people between 57 and 65 are still to reach services. And very often I find that group of people, particularly in the older Irish population, say with dementia, they're stuck between services. The younger adult population services don't want to take them because they're not 65, and the older adult populations don't know what to do with them because they're not addiction specialists. So what I've tried to do, certainly in South East London at the Maudsley, is bridge this gap, if you like, in terms of service and need. I wanted to show you this. I'm sure that you probably wouldn't have seen this. The term alcohol dependence syndrome was coined in the early 1960s by the late great Professor Griffith Edwards, who actually was one of the forefathers of addiction psychiatry in the UK, in the world actually. And he worked, funnily enough, you might like to know this, sounds like my son Michael Caine here, but you might like to know that he set up the first alcohol information centres in the 1960s, and they were one-stop, they weren't addiction psychiatry clinics, they were one-stop shops where people could get help with housing, with benefits, they could be referred to peer support, very revolutionary, and probably he was sort of founder of harm reduction in the community, and that was in Kennington in southeast London. And what he said was it would be too optimistic to suppose that the relative underrepresentation of subjects in the older age groups among clients of information centres is just explained by the fact that they've got the treatment or that they've gone back to normal drinking without treatment. It's the fact that people didn't live very long 60 years ago. Now, the average age now at death is early 80s for men and mid 80s for women. And I can tell you, unfortunately, now, people are growing older in spite of alcohol, not because of it. And what it means is that there's a huge lack of quality of life for a larger number of years for populations who are at risk. And I just wanted to show you, this as well. This was by the first president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, whose name is Sir Martin Roth. And he was, this is again in my book, funnily enough, this is the anecdote that is pervasive in my first book, Catch Me When I Fall, about the fact that the person, the psychiatrist who went to see the lady, I won't give away too much in the book, it took that person months before they even discovered that the person had an alcohol problem, because of the shame and stigma, and because no one ever asked. That was the reason. And so I always say to my colleagues, you go and see someone and it appears they've got a personality change, or they've had what looks like delirium, so that acute confusion, and they've gone into hospital and it isn't a urinary infection, it's not a chest infection. And people fail to realize that it's probably something like DTs, and they just get sent home again. Or that people have got memory problems and no one's considered alcohol. You're onto a hiding to nothing there. And it should not be happening in 2022 that people are not asked about alcohol and their alcohol use in a very tactful, in a very non-judgmental, in a very non-confrontational way. And the other thing that you probably may like to know is that when I first started as an all-day psychiatrist, when I first started talking to people about alcohol and asking about their alcohol use, I used to put alcohol in the past medical history. Of course, if you put it as a medical problem, the first thing people are going to do is clam up and not tell you. So I then put it in the past mental health history. That didn't help either. What I do now is I put it right at the end of the interview in terms of their culture and lifestyle. So right at the end of the questions about their everyday activities and where they go and who their friends are and how independent they are, I just sort of casually mention, well, do you have a drink now and again? Where's your local when you do drink? Very non-threatening. That can open up doors to a conversation about alcohol that would not be achieved by simply going in there gung-ho and doing an alcohol rating scale. And that is one of the benefits of working in the community, where you can actually try and test what works and doesn't work. So just leading on to alcohol and dementia specifically. Now, I've had a lot of dealings with the media, and the reason for that is because I consider this to be my baby, if you like, because I've been researching, lobbying, doing all sorts of things in the area of older people and alcohol for over 20 years. And I feel that it's my duty to give the media an informed view. And of course, if you start talking to the media about statistics, a headline to say that 20% of people drink over sensible limits, no one's going to buy it, are they? So you get headlines like this, and I can't help but feed the media some of these things, because no one will read the story. But the problem with the media is that they're there to sell stories. And of course, on the one hand, you get the Guardian saying that older people are drinking too much and it's an NHS ticking time bomb, which it is, strangely enough, and so is dementia in some ways. But you then get the Daily Mail with their kind of reactionary, middle-class, leafy suburban readers who like to think that their drinking is somehow being a benefit to them. And that is the crux of my talk today. And of course, you know who that phrase is, with whom that phrase is associated. I don't need to go into that. And I just want to put something before you. When you get the I don't know who, it's usually the Daily Mail, isn't it? Or the Daily Mail or the BMJ or some article and says alcohol has health benefits. I can tell you that after 20 years of research, it's not any clinical work, I've been doing research as well, 20 years of research in the public health arena with regards to alcohol and so-called health benefits, I can tell you that the current low risk guidelines for alcohol are 14 units per, which that's 2 units per day. I can tell you that the only so-called health benefit from alcohol is for people with severe heart disease who are using alcohol as aspirin. That is the only benefit. Anything above 1 unit per day, on average, everyone's different, anything above 1 unit per day, that half a pint of beer or something like a small glass of wine, anything above, I don't want to put you off drinking, by the way, but on average, anything above those limits per day is associated with a higher risk of all-cause mortality from things like stroke, cancer, even dementia. I think the limit for dementia is something like 1.5 units a day. It's less than a pint of beer. So, the reason for why everyone's confused is because when the studies come out, people have what's called an intervention group. So this is people who drink, okay? And then they compare them with what's called a control group, people who don't drink. Unfortunately, what happens is that in the so-called drinking group, the people who drink heavily will underestimate their drinking. And in the control or reference group, the people you might not think drink at all are very often people who used to drink and have quit because of health reasons from their drinking. So how can you possibly compare those two groups if they've both got the artificially deflated or inflated number of people who deny their drinking, underestimating people who drink, and overestimating people who did drink but are now sick because of their drink? And that is the cause of a lot of the fake news and misleading headlines that you will see, that there are so-called health benefits from alcohol. There are no health benefits from alcohol. I can tell you that, and that's not through my preaching, because I see people who are at the end of the spectrum where they're literally so ill that they need our help. I'm talking about the people who are sipping their Merlot or having their pint of beer at the pub. That is a proven fact. So let me just go on to my next slide. So a little bit more of fact for you. When we talk about the way that alcohol influences health in research, we look at what's called disability adjusted life years. They're called DALYs. All right. What a DALY is, a DALY means you sit risk factors in front of a panel of experts, and you say, which of these risk factors from the experience that you have is associated with the highest number of extra years of disability for that person. Okay, and if you add all those extra years of disability across the population, you get a total number of DALYs per segment of the population per 100,000. And really interesting, over the 27 years that's measured, and that's not too far from sort of 5 years ago, because don't forget it takes years, there's a lag period, it takes years to get this data into analysis. For the 50 to 69-year-old age group in the UK, alcohol has gone up from the 14th highest risk factor to the 5th highest risk factor. But that's not all. Look at the 70-plus-year-old. You're not going to believe, I didn't actually believe this myself until I looked at it again and again and again. You look at the 70-plus-year age group, and you're looking at an increase in the risk factor league table from 61st place to 18th place. That is just staggeringly phenomenal. So I'm not just talking about the clinical work that I do, I'm talking about public health, how alcohol influences health in the general population. So that is health in general. When you come to dementia, so I'll talk about this later, there's a lot of confusion between dementia and Korsakoff's, and I'll try my best to try and make sure that I explain that to you in the way that's understandable late in another slide. If you look at hospital admissions for amnestic syndrome, that's another term for Wernicke-Korsakoff's, okay? And you look at the population of people with that mental disorder over the course of time, you can see there's a relative stability in the people over 50, under 50, but an increase in the number over 50. You might not think 736 or 789 is a large number, but I can tell you, if you've got someone lying in a hospital bed with complex physical health problems and they're living with amnestic syndrome or Korsakoff's, you're talking about a huge number of bed days. So that's 789 is not multiplied by 1, it's multiplied by, in some cases, several months. And that's the important thing to bear in mind. So this is a little bit of research. I don't want to sort of blast you with the data. This is more the kind of technical research side. And I'm just going to give you 2 studies here. The first study, and these are huge studies. These are not just like the back of a fag packet kind of things that, oh, I went and saw 7 patients and they showed these. These are huge, very well controlled for what's called robust, very relevant studies. The first one was called the Whitehall 2 study, which is a large study that's followed people over the course of 30 and I think 40 and maybe even 50 years by now. And the first study found that if you drink more, that this is for, I think, people who were over the age of 60, who have followed up over 30 years. If they drank more than 7 units of alcohol a week, I say that's the equivalent of half a pint of beer a day. It was associated with structural brain changes, which was faster than those who'd never drunk at all. Okay, and the second one was 1.1 million people, so not 550, 1.1 million people with a diagnosis of dementia. And what they found was, I mean, this is completely staggering to me. Mary talked earlier about things like smoking, talked about mental health, things like stroke and so on. The really surprising thing is that alcohol use disorders were the strongest, single most modifiable. In other words, if you stopped, you could somehow prevent the progression or in some cases reverse, as I'll come on to later, the progression of certain diseases, even when compared with smoking, depression, and high blood pressure. So it's no joke, alcohol, the relevance of alcohol to the older population, both the older Irish and the older non-Irish populations in the UK, but predominantly more so for the older Irish population, for whom, as I say, shame, stigma and stereotyping has haunted the community for, I say, not just 60 years, but for 200 years. It's very sad, through countless generations. I mean, I've seen people, second, third, probably even fourth generation Irish communities where drink is still very much a part of their lifestyle, and still you've got the cultural stereotyping and the failure, the lack of support, and the kind of the shame and help seeking. And I'm very keen to try and help to reverse that if I can. Let's move on to something a little bit different. We're just looking at the time, and I hope to have time for questions later. Alcohol and the brain, not just about Korsakoffs. This is a very technical slide, but and this is mainly for a medical audience. But I want to show to you the importance of one thing. When we're in medical school, we're told that you either have Korsakoffs or you have nothing else. When I became an audit psychiatrist, I can tell you particularly over the last 10 years, I've discovered that it's like hen's teeth. It's almost impossible. I've never seen it. I've never seen a patient with either Korsakoffs or alcohol-related dementia. These are the sort of purple and the yellow and the beige circles, ellipses there, who hasn't at some stage during their drinking history banged their head and damaged their brain through traumatic brain injury, or had a stroke, or what's called a subdural hematoma. That's a clot outside the brain that causes pressure on the brain. So it's very complex when you talk about alcohol and dementia. It's not just about that alcohol's damaging the brain cells, and that's what leads to the dementia, or that alcohol means that you can't use the thiamine or the vitamin B1 that you have in your diet, and that causes the Korsakoffs and Wernicke's. It's not just that; it's the fact that you've damaged the brain through other means, which is it's not commonly, that's not a commonly known observation, excuse me, even amongst my my colleagues. So what do we mean about alcohol-related dementia? Now, to definitively have a diagnosis of alcohol-related dementia, it's a clinical diagnosis, okay? But you have to be drinking quite a lot to actually develop dementia. So there are people who may not drink enough to put them in the dementia category. They may have developed Wernicke's or Korsakoffs, and don't forget that the Wernicke's is reversible if you can catch it early enough, and it doesn't go on to progress to Korsakoffs. Korsakoffs is pure memory problems, okay? And dementia is memory problems plus other areas of the brain being affected, very similar to Alzheimer's disease. And I think that's the reason why when people who drink present to memory clinics, or they go to their family doctor, or they go to a geriatrician, the geriatrician will say, oh, they've got Alzheimer's disease, or they've got stroke dementia, because one, they didn't ask about the alcohol, and two, because they don't think alcohol-related dementia exists. Well, I can tell you it definitively does. And to be much more certain that the role that alcohol plays in the dementia is actually a cause of the dementia, obviously you have to make sure that you diagnose someone has a diagnosis of dementia in terms of the testing that you do in the different areas of memory problems. But there are two other things. First of all, that you have to be drinking at least 60 units per week, if that's sort of like the equivalent of 30 pints of beer per week, or five bottles of wine per week, for example, and 50 units for women over the course of more than 5 years. I'm not saying that there aren't people who drink less than that over a shorter time period, or people who drink more than that over a longer time period, but that is on average what it takes to damage your brain enough for you to develop dementia. But one of the take-home messages I want to give to you today is that if you develop alcohol-related dementia, okay, and you stop drinking, I can tell you beyond reasonable doubt that unless your brain is affected by Alzheimer's or stroke or something else that goes wrong with your brain, okay, your memory problems will just stabilize out. I've got people, I'm actually in a specialist dementia care unit at the moment, And of the male patients that I had, half of them, can you imagine, in the dementia unit, half of them had alcohol-related, some form of alcohol-related brain injury. So I'm sure across the length and breadth of the UK, there are people sitting in care homes where alcohol-related dementia has never been considered. But I do want to make sure that you know that that in quite a few people who stop drinking, there's been research to suggest, and this should give you hope, if ever you try and talk to someone who won't seek help with their alcohol problems and they've got memory problems, that there is evidence to suggest that within the first 2 months of stopping drinking, there are reversible brain changes. There is some reversibility in what's called cognitive function and memory. Probably the only so-called type of so-called dementia where that has been proven. Just a bit of interest for you, hopefully. I'm not expecting you to read a brain scan, but I just want to show you a few things. This is a brain with no damage, taken through different planes, if you like. One through a side plane, one through an across plane, one through a kind of other sideways plane, if you like. And you can see the difference here between alcohol-related dementia and Korsakoff's. So with Korsakoff's, you don't get so much of what's called an atrophy or shrinkage of the brain, okay, as you do with alcohol-related dementia. So in other words, sorry, that's no damage at all, okay? That's alcohol-related dementia. And sorry, what I'm trying to say is that with alcohol-related dementia, you do get brain shrinkage, but with Korsakoff's and alcohol-related dementia, you get the brain shrinking, unfortunately, a widening of, because the brain shrinks, you get a widening of the areas which are called the ventricles of the fluid that bathes the brain, and they look a lot more, they look a lot wider. But you also get changes in this area here, okay, and that's called the area around the midbrain, and that's the area that's damaged in Korsakoff. So in alcohol-related dementia, you won't get that change, but when you've got a combination of those, you get a combination of both. And I've yet to see someone who develops alcohol-related dementia who hasn't already had Korsakoff's. And that's the other thing about doing what I do. You realize that there are very often no distinct disorders. And the problem with alcohol-related dementia is it's not just to do with memory, it's to do with what we call frontal lobe function. What do the frontal lobes do? They are the parts of the brain that are concerned with social behavior. So the reason why I think that alcohol-related dementia is missed in people who drink is because the family will say, oh, they've always been alcoholics, or the doctor will say, oh, they're always drunk, and they're always a bit difficult, they're always a bit sort of irritable, a bit stubborn. They won't see the personality change associated with frontal lobe damage, which is from the alcohol and from the heavy drinking. And there are all sorts of subtle things, problems with decision making, that kind of inertia that you get that could be mistaken for inebriation and drunkenness. They might be less organized with tasks, easily distracted, poor judgment. And a lot of these things can be attributed to either the drink or someone's personality. And before you know it, this is again the kind of thread that runs through my first book, is before you know it, you've missed it, and it's too late. I won't go into these next few slides in too much detail, because obviously there's going to be some questions, but mental capacity is very important when it comes to alcohol use, and I'll tell you why it's important. For younger people who continue to drink, very often they're aware that they're drinking in excess, and they say, I'm prepared to take the risk. The problem with older people who drink is because it destroys, where are we? Because it destroys this area of the brain, the frontal lobe, this area of the brain, that's concerned with things like judgment, and it's concerned with decision making, you get what's called a lack of mental capacity. And luckily for me, if there are people who lack mental capacity around their drinking, and they say that they don't say, I'm drinking, I know I'm drinking, I'm prepared to take this, they're not aware of their drinking, you can actually manage their drinking under what's called the Mental Capacity Act, and take more stringent measures to limit their alcohol intake in their best interest, which is probably an advantage of it. But sometimes it is too late and sometimes it doesn't reverse. But that's what's called harm reduction, and that is a decision to be made in conjunction with the family. I just want to give you an idea, to give you hope about if someone's got early memory problems and they're drinking. These are the outcomes of people with heavy drinking 1 to 2 years after abstinence, okay? It's completely different from any other type of risk factor that I know, even things like stroke. More than a quarter, this is one of the only studies that's been done, it's in France, more than a quarter living in the community, were living in the community with various degrees of support. Between a third and 3/4 were absent from alcohol. As I say, cognitive impairment was stable, or it had reversed to some degree after abstinence. There was a reversal of some brain changes, and there were some things like attention, that I won't bore you with the detail, but there's some bits of the memory tests, if you like, that improved after stopping drinking. So what I want to make sure that I hope you understand after this is that alcohol-related dementia is distinct from Alzheimer's disease. And what I didn't mention earlier was that one of the really interesting findings from alcohol-related dementia is that you get a preservation of word finding. Now, you know from people that you've heard about or seen, or maybe in your own family, problems with finding the right word for things is a very early feature of Alzheimer's disease. Okay. Strangely enough, and don't ask me why, I haven't been able to explain this yet, with alcohol-related dementia, even in the sort of middle and late stages, people are still able to find the word for things. And that's very often a way of distinguishing Alzheimer's disease from alcohol-related dementia. That's if you're having difficulty in making that decision. And the other core point that I made earlier is that with alcohol-related dementia, it remains it's not progressive. So in fact, it can't really strictly be called dementia, I suppose, but it is static or partially reversible if you stop drinking. So with that, I will stop sharing my slides.
So thank you very much, Tony. What an informative and packed and thoughtful presentation that you've given to everybody. We're going to open this time now up for questions and comments and contributions. So please feel free to type questions into the chat if you want us to put them to Tony. I'm going to start off with a question about your work around policy. So you spoke a lot about your drive to make changes, I guess, so not just to think about individual patients, individual people that you see, but to think about the wider system. Can you comment a little bit more about that? Can you give us some encouragement about how we as individuals and community organisations can work with health professionals to change policy?
Absolutely. From my point of view, it took me years to influence policy because no one was listening. When I first started, people thought it was my problem in Bermondsey. No one was prepared to listen, and it was only over the course of time that I was able to influence policy. So what I did was that this is a lesson to hopefully to all of you, that partnership is hugely important. So what I did was I linked together with an addiction psychiatrist, with a geriatrician, with a GP, and with voluntary organisations to produce a report called Our Invisible Addicts. You might want to go out and look at it. It's on the internet. It was released in 2011, and it was revised in 2018. And what I was really pleased to see was in 2011 was that, because I kept talking about older people and drinking, and it was on the BBC and it was in the media, and it still is in the media to some degree. What happened was that over the course of time, it actually led to the government getting together a committee to look at alcohol-related harm. And I like to think, although I can't take sole responsibility for that, I like to think that that's what changed drinking limits. I mean, that is a big claim to make. That's a huge claim to make. But I'm pretty sure after 25 years of drinking limits being stagnant, I'm pretty sure that after publishing our Invisible Addicts, that drinking limits were changed. And the other thing that I did was I kind of plagued the Department of Health. I kept asking for meetings with the Department of Health, and I went to meet them. I went to meet the people who were concerned with public health, the people who were concerned with alcohol policy, the people who were concerned with dementia. And I eventually managed to get asking about alcohol as part of what's called policy standards in terms of NICE guidance. So if you go to something called QS 188 in NICE guidance, you'll see that for the first time, it says there that older people should be asked about their drinking. And the second thing that I managed to do was within what's called the Community Mental Health Framework for adults and older adults, I managed to get a huge section there on dual diagnosis, so people who use drugs and alcohol and have got mental health problems, why it's really important to be able to not deny people with mental health problems that the opportunity to detect those mental health problems within addiction services, and conversely within old age psychiatry or mental health services, not be able to miss the people who've got addiction problems. So that's what I managed to do, hopefully, and hopefully give you hope that you just keep banging the drum. Someone will listen, but what you've got to do is get the data out there. Politicians, for example, won't listen to you unless you've got sort of data about admissions, you've got data about harm, population data, and they won't listen to you unless everyone's saying the same thing. So unless you're linked up with a group of professionals from the voluntary the voluntary social care and enterprise organisations and within health and social care, no one's going to listen to you unless really your view is informed by data, but also integrated in terms of partnerships. So.
Thank you, Tony. I'm going to invite Mary to ask the next question. Mary, would you like to turn your camera on? Thanks.
Yep, Tony, you mentioned the tsunami that is beginning to hit us and will continue to hit us. One of the things I want to ask you to say something about is that kind of the grey area of drinking. You know, the not the heavy drinker or the binge drinker, but the few glasses of wine.
Yes.
Because I think that's important in terms of prevention or at least delaying dementia. Yeah.
So what I don't want to do is I don't want to scare you all off drinking. And there are drinking limits. There is the 14 units per week drinking limit. So on average, if you drink more than 14 units of alcohol per week, you are putting your body and your brain at risk of that. But what we do, as I said, what we do know now is that from a public health point of view, and you've got an older brain, if you like. So if you're older, your brain is more sensitive to things like Alzheimer's, to stroke, because it has aged. Okay, the amount of alcohol that will damage your brain and your body as you get older is much less than it is, say, for younger people. So I would say for the 14 unit limit, that should be reduced to something like 10, 11 units for older people. So that's what my research has informed me. That's what my clinical practice has informed me. I've seen people drinking within the 14 unit limit who've also got other medical problems, like they've had strokes, or they've got Alzheimer's disease, or they've got women who've got smaller livers to be able to metabolize the alcohol, and they've developed alcohol problems at a much earlier stage than you would have expected them to. So I think it's a lot more revealing the public health data than the clinical data is. See what I mean?
And I think you've shown from some of your earlier slides that it's probably never too late to give up.
Yes.
Or to slow down at least.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Tony. We have a question here. It's about a woman in her 70s who is a sort of twice weekly binge drinker, and the question centres around how you would approach that with sensitivity without, sort of provoking shame, but also how you would raise that as a concern.
Okay, so this is one of the things I learned actually when I was more in the addictions field than in the mental health field. And there's something called motivational interviewing. Now, what that means is it's using information that you have and that the person who's drinking has to be able to inform their behavior when you want to see, hopefully, and they want to see a change in their behavior. And what it does, it uses both the information that you have and their kind of innate willingness to change to be able to instill behavioral change. So it would go something along the lines of this. It would be very sort of soft edge. You'd say to them, and of course people very often don't listen to their family. That's the last person they listen to. They very often listen to their GP or some other health professional. But that person would say to them that I see that maybe you're saying that your mood's been affected, or that that you're falling, or that you feel hungover in the morning. I wonder if that's related to anything to do with your drinking. So you put the question out there to them. You don't immediately lecture them and say that, don't you know you're drinking too much? Because what they'll do is they'll completely clam up and they won't have the conversation with you anymore. So I think it's more to do with using the information that you have that's very non-threatening and non-judgmental and very factual to be able to drive their motivation to change, and that will obviously need several iterations or several repetitions for them to be able to appreciate that. But that's the approach that we would normally have, which I hope helps.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Can you comment on how, over the course of your time, your professional working life, attitudes have perhaps changed over time, both around alcohol consumption and also around the dementia?
Yeah. Well, I think the problem with attitudes around dementia are that no one thinks that alcohol-related dementia exists, which obviously does. I think attitudes towards dementia have changed because dementia used to be like, some 50 years ago, dementia used to be like cancer. Cancer was the first thing that we never talked about, and dementia is the next thing that we don't talk about. So I think because of the media and because of organisations such as Mary's project, the Older Irish, the Memory Loss Project, I think that increasing awareness has been incredibly important. And one of the things that I didn't tell you this earlier, one of the things that I've been doing over the last 10 years is I've been looking at the readers' comments in the Guardian, the Daily Mail, after an article has been published based on the information that I give. And I think attitudes towards drinking, particularly in older people, are changing. Before, it used to be comments like, just mind your own business, or you're talking a lot of hot air, or I don't believe it. Now I see many more comments to say that, well, perhaps this amount isn't good for me, or my grandfather, I'm worried that my uncle has developed, or my aunt's developed this problem because they're drinking too. More of a lack of awareness, I suppose, in the last 5 to 10 years. So I think attitudes are changing. Thank you.
Would you like to talk a little more about the books, Soul Trader and Catch Me When I Fall?
Yeah, I have great difficulty in trying to have a balance between plugging them and profiting from them. But I made it very clear when I did it. So both these books were, the first book actually required probably about 6 months of research, not just in the history of the docking community in Bermondsey, which is where it's based, but on the older Irish community, which is why I know so much about, I won't give too much away, about the Irish potato famine and the migration of older Irish people to Bermondsey in the 1850s. I won't give too much away. So it was very much, the first book was very much based around social justice, around the detection of alcohol problems, and I won't say anything more than that. And the profits go to a charity called Time and Talents in Bermondsey. The second, so I'm trying to break the stereotype of drinking, and that was an older lady who drank. Okay, the first book. The second book, called Soul Trader, is about an older middle-class man who's got drug problems. And no one ever associates drug problems with sort of wealthy, privileged older people. And so the profits from that go to Action on Addiction, the Action on Addiction campaign. So I'm not making a penny out of this, and I would say that what I'm trying to do is kind of reinstill the sense of social justice in society and getting people the treatment they need. But not only that, to make sure that the time and effort I put into kind of the narrative is actually translating into people benefiting, and that's the form of giving the money to charity.
Thank you. Another question from people: do you think that drinking will eventually be seen as smoking in society?
So seen as what? Sorry.
As smoking. Do you think drinking will eventually be seen as smoking is in society?
Oh God, that's a difficult question. So the thing about smoking was no one believed that smoking killed, but then smoking was associated with lung cancer, wasn't it? The problem with drinking is twofold. One, it's part of our social glue, isn't it? So people go to the pub to drink. It's part of what holds society together. The other problem with drinking is that you can't definitively say that a glass of wine per day is going to kill you, but you can say that smoking one cigarette a day is more likely to kill you than from lung cancer or from respiratory. That's the problem with drinking. It's sort of like a kind of continuum from low risk drinking to high risk drinking. I think that's the problem. So I don't think it will ever be equated in the same way as alcohol. As smoking will be alcohol. But what I think is happening is that younger people are drinking less. And if you want to know what the next biggest problem in older people is going to be, it's going to be cannabis. because older people who smoke cannabis when they're younger, we're already seeing those people in old age psychiatry services. So.
Thank you. And a last question before we move to close. You've spoken about stigma in with alcohol consumption in connection with dementia as well. Is there any kind of stigma that you experience as a professional working in this field? Do you get do you experience being judged for the choice of the field that you've gone into?
Yeah, of course, forever, I suppose. It isn't happening as much now. The problem is when you take something new and it doesn't neatly fall within a particular category. So I'm not an addiction psychiatrist, I'm not a public health physician, but I've made it my business to get my knowledge, clinical skills and research up to speed where I'm probably as well informed in the field as you like as other things. I think people just look at me with a bit of suspicion. They think to themselves, well, what possible benefit is he having from doing this other than his own fame and fortune? I'm not making a penny, but I mean, I calculated that over the last 30 years, over the last 20 years, I've probably spent about £10,000. I spent £2,000 on getting the first book published. I spent £4,000 on my MSc. So, I mean, which other person would want to do that for any reason other than to improve the lot of society? And that's what I've tried to do. It has very much a social perspective to what I've been doing throughout my career.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's been such an inspiring as well as informative session. And so you've really emphasised the theme of social justice through the work that people can do in this field. And thank you so much also for the very wonderful donation of your research to Irish in Britain. I'm going to bring in Mary to say a few words now. So Mary, would you like to come in?
Just to say a very big thank you, Tony, a very informative but very sensitive session. And we really appreciate your interest and your knowledge about the Irish community, because as you highlighted in terms of statistics, we are invisible and we've got lots of problems. So it really has been wonderful to have you here. And we may have you back to talk about cannabis in the future.
Yeah, probably in 10 years' time. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to Tony and to Mary and to everybody who's joined in today and for all of the questions. We will be posting a recording of this onto our website, so if you would like to watch again or encourage others to watch, please do. And please go away with the inspiration of how we can work together as individuals and services together to create change in society as well. And we would warmly invite all of you back not next Thursday, in a couple of Thursdays' time for a Thoughtful Thursday with our guest Alton Cowley, looking at reminiscence and experiences of Irish migrants taking the boat to and from Ireland. So thank you very much for joining, and we look forward to staying in touch.